I'm Danica Lorer, and this is Lit Happens, your celebration of the literary arts here in Saskatchewan. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Robert Clipperton. Robert is a retired history teacher and a member of the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society. Today, we're here to talk about the Society's book, The Cypress Hills Massacre, which Robert edited. Welcome to Lit Happens.
Oh, thank you.
So, I know you've been involved with the Society for quite a time. Give me a little background about how this book came to be.
Well, I think it was about 2010 that the Archaeological Society partnered with Parks Canada in terms of providing volunteers for an archaeological excavation at the Massacre site, which is in Fort Walsh National Historic Park. And I was one of the volunteers that was there. The archaeological report came out about 2 years later, and Parks Canada wasn't interested in putting it together for publication for a general audience, and so the Archaeological Society here in Saskatoon took it and added a bunch of historical background and some other pieces to it, and has put it out as a book.
And so, tell me a little bit about the pieces. I know we have typewritten versions of what were letters and documents. There are some scans of documents. Just give me a little overview of what we find in the book.
Well, the massacre took place in 1873 and is sort of remarkable about everything we don't know about the massacre, and that's been the way all the way up. There were researchers back in the 1930s and 40s who were trying to figure out what was the truth here, and I guess I've left it such that when you read through the whole thing, you can decide what your truth is, because there is a great deal of discrepancy in terms of how many people were killed. Was this a massacre with perpetrators and victims? Was this a fight between two warring parties? Where exactly did it take place? The archaeological report is a big chunk of it. Another piece is drawing from contemporary sources. So newspaper articles, letters from archives, victim impact statements. There were a couple of trials associated with it. We've got a chapter on the whiskey trade that was happening at the time. We've got another article on ground penetrating radar and its application to archaeological excavations. We've got a narrative of the first archaeological excavations that took place there in 1973, sorry, which is actually quite humorous, written as a retrospective. So there's a range of things.
It's an archaeological dig going through the book too, just because you uncover layers and layers of information and story.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because that's what it was like doing the archival research. Is you kept uncovering other little directions to go to and other little hints, and layer by layer was exactly like doing an archaeological dig, except instead of using we were actually using toothbrushes and dental picks when we were doing the fine archaeological work on site. So different tools, but a very similar experience.
And that's got to be exciting for somebody who loves history, to find something that you haven't seen before as you're uncovering something in the archives or in a letter.
Well, and you're always hoping to find something that no one else has found. And I won't say that I did that, but part of the goal was to make the story accessible. Mm-hmm. And although those sources are all public sources, not everybody has access to a microfilm reader. Not everybody has the access to get documents out of the Montana archives and then pulling it all together.
Well, and that's what's lovely is pulling the whole thing together. So if you're interested in it, you can find out without having to go to Montana and having to go to Regina and having to go to Fort Walsh. You can sit in your living room and take that journey. Yeah,
that's right. It's all there. And it's not the kind of book that you're going to sit down and say, gee, I couldn't put the book down, because it's pretty detail heavy. And the people I've talked to say, oh yeah, I've read the whole book, but I read it in 20-minute intervals.
And I think that's a really nice way to read, because we often think, oh, I don't have time to read. But if you can have a piece that you can pick up and read for 20 minutes and know that you don't have to read the same part again, like in a mystery novel maybe, you have to keep the narrative going, and if you put it down, it's hard to open up again because you might forget what happened 20 pages back. And if you've left it for 2 months, it's difficult. But something like this, you could put down for a week or two, pick it up, read another section, and just keep.
Well, and the other aspect of the story is that it's one that's not well told. In the Saskatchewan history curriculum for Canadian history, there's a sentence that mentions the Cypress Hills Massacre. And to actually find what actually happened, there are a lot of has been written that's been exaggerated or has been told from without, I guess, sufficient research or from a specific political point of view. Guy van der Hegge's The Englishman's Boy is based on the events that come out of that book. And
so there are other books that are factual books, but there are also stories that people have written.
There are, but this is the first thing that's come out since, I think, the 1970s, and certainly without the benefit of the archaeological work that's been done since then. So.
And that can bring you fact and proof of things that even firsthand memories, if someone has a political bias, their writing on something that they witnessed will be different than someone with a different bias. And if you find those pieces in the ground, sometimes they give you greater proof than anything else can.
It can, yeah, and even exactly where the event took place was, in terms of the locals. Back in the 1940s, there were 4 or 5 different locations that different people would say, no, it happened over here, no, it happened over there, and it was the archaeological work that was the positive proof. And then there's all kinds of information that comes up in terms of what the daily life of the people were, what they ate, what kind of clothing they wore, which kind of weapons they used, which sort of animals that they were either consuming or trapping for the pelts.
And it's interesting because it's not a story that's ancient history. It's only 130 years old.
Well, it is, and then that was where it was really surprising when people first started to look into it. Only 50 years had gone by, and the same questions kind of remain. Although we've got the ability now to reach farther and look farther into archival sources. You're not dealing with sending off that letter and waiting for weeks and weeks and weeks of getting a response. And of course, there's things like photocopying back then. The photocopies that I found that were made in the 40s were a black background with the writing in white. Oh, wow. And the transcription was of handwritten documents. The transcription was like word by word. You kind of went one word at a time and then went back and looked at your sentence. And people weren't necessarily literate. So you get somebody taking this event sort of sparked the beginning of the Northwest Mounted Police. And so at the very beginning, you've got somebody who perhaps wasn't all that literate themselves taking a statement from a witness, probably through an interpreter. And the spelling, particularly of names, you almost have to say them out loud a few times and go, oh, he means this person by writing it that way.
And that's really interesting. You see that even when you go back in your family history and are looking through census records. There are places where there's shift in the way names change.
Yeah, and the other, I guess, challenge was to try to get the First Nation part of it, because, of course, they weren't the ones writing the history. And did have some communications. The survivors of the massacre ended up at Carry the Kettle First Nation for the most part, and had numbers of conversations with individuals there. But of course, they're collecting their own history as well.
Mm-hmm. And then you have an oral history rather than a written history.
Yes, and I got bits and pieces of that have been written here and there. But and of course, there were statements from the one trial. There was a Canadian trial and an American trial that drew on some of that as well.
And that interesting story of the border and what happens when you have that sort of disagreement that crosses a border that really was different than it is today.
Well, and it was the lawless time of the Canadian West when the Hudson Bay Company had given up control of those lands, but the Canadian government had yet to assert itself And so there was no police force around to sort of investigate matters, and there was a sense of outrage in the Canadian press that, I'm not saying that the Canadians treated First Nations people better than the Americans did, although I think we generally did, but it was an outrage that, you know, they came across and killed our Indians, you know, how dare they do that, was very much there in the editorials in the Canadian papers of the time.
Well, Robert, thank you for coming and talking to me today. That's all the time we have.
Well, thank you very much.
I'm Danica Lorer, and this is Lit Happens. You can find past episodes by going to YouTube and looking for Shaw TV Saskatoon. You can find me on Facebook or Twitter. If you have a project or a book you'd like to talk about, you can email me at danicalorer@gmail.com. Thank you for watching.